I met him when I was 18, and I began in the year later, in 34, I began analysis with him. We went out there to the tower, and out of the bushes suddenly we were standing around kind of, you know, awkwardly as one does, not knowing what was going to happen. And then out of the bushes came a man, and I was deeply impressed by him. I thought naturally he was a Methuselah, because when you are 18, you think a 58-year-old is ready for the cemetery. He told that story, which you can read in the memories, about this girl who was on the moon and had to fight a demon, and the black demon got her. And he pretended, he told it in a way as if she really had been on the moon and it had happened. And I was very rationalistically trained from school, so I said indignantly, but she imagined to be on the moon, or she dreamt it, but she wasn't on the moon. And he looked at me earnestly and said, yes, she was on the moon. I still remember looking over the lake there and thinking, and either this man is crazy or I am too stupid to understand what he means. And then suddenly it dawned on me, he means that what happens psychically is the real reality. And this other moon, this stony desert which goes around the earth, that's illusion, or that's only pseudo-reality. And that hit me tremendously deeply. When I crawled rather drunk into bed because he gave us a lot of Burgundy, that evening I thought it'll take you 10 years to digest what you experience today.
Both Jung and I minded most of all about wholeness, about becoming whole, and that I'd got at it through my art by always trying to draw or paint things that looked whole. Animals, primitives, anything that seemed still at one with itself and whole. And he got at it by studying the things that were wrong with people, and then realizing the way to get it right was to find their wholeness, to find the opposite to the thing that was destroying them so terribly. And of course I went through a tremendous encounter with the unconscious. One always does in analysis. Particularly with him, he didn't let you pick flowers by the way, sort of.
When you met him in the club or when you met him privately or in analysis, it was always a man interested in the, I would like to use the word, in the supernatural food. Always. Yeah. Into the depths. And you see, you could come into his room in analysis. And he was just speaking about the dreams you had before, last night. Not knowing them, but he was involved. He was so transparent for people. And that was a fascinating thing in the relationship with Jung. Therefore, everybody who knew Jung had the feeling he speaks one's own language.
We started talking, and I went home with him afterwards. And to Mrs. Jung's despair, we sat talking until about 3 o'clock in the morning without break. And again, it was I had this very strange feeling, although it was snowing outside, bitterly cold, that I was sitting around one of the first fires in a camp somewhere in the bush in Africa, talking, as you can only talk in those conditions. And I said to him, why don't you come back to Africa with me? He said, you know, when I came back from Mount Elgon and from Kenya and living amongst the witch doctors of Africa, he said, I found so much witchcraft in Switzerland. I felt that I had to deal with all this witchcraft first before I could, before I can travel again. And he used to refer to himself as an old witch doctor. Very often when people asked him, are you a Protestant? Are you a Catholic? He said, don't ask me these questions. He said, you know, I'm only an old African who finds his God in his dreams. And he really meant that. He really meant that. We had this tremendous human, almost animal warmth and immediacy. It was the immediacy of the laugh that got one.
Schopenhauer said that humour was the only divine quality of man. And that Basel helped him with a lot. The Baslers have an extraordinary sense of humour, and their carnival is really marvellous.
Jung took you there once to the
Yes, he did. A whole lot of us. We went there the night before and got up at 4 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning, I think, to see the so-called Morgenstreich. And the procession comes through with lights. It's most impressive.
This feeling that he had, that if man lived his life religiously, if he lived his life symbolically, then it was almost as if what the theologians called God, and my Zulus called Mkulu, the first spirit, where the first spirit had passed over some of his power and some of his responsibilities to the human being, and that the human being had a God-like task to perform in creation, and the extent to which he performed it, he derived his meaning. It's a very important part of Jung's thinking.
Oh, well, I just paid a visit to him in Vienna, and then we talked for 13 hours without interruption.
13 hours
for
without
13
interruption.
hours without interruption. We didn't realize that we were almost dead at the end of it, but it was tremendously interesting. He was the old man and had a great experience, and he was, of course, way ahead of me, and so I settled down to learn something first. I had written that book that cost me my friendship with Freud because he couldn't accept it.
Yes.
To him, the unconscious was a product of consciousness,
yes.
And it simply contained the remnants. I mean, it was sort of a storeroom where all the discarded things of consciousness were heaped up and left. But to me, the unconscious then was already a matrix, a sort of basis of consciousness of a creative nature, namely capable of autonomous acts, yes. Autonomous intrusions into yes. consciousness. Man's soul is a complicated thing, and it takes sometimes half a lifetime to get somewhere in one's psychological development. You know, it is by no means always a matter of psychotherapy or treatment of neuroses.
this whole psychology has also the aspect of a pedagogical method in the widest sense of the word. It is something.
Education.
It is an education. It is something like antique philosophy, and not what we understand by a technique. It is something that touches upon the whole of man, and which challenges also the whole of man in the patient or whatever the receiving part is, as well as in the doctor.
One of the tremendous things which Jung did was to always emphasize the aspect of man's totality. And our totality is not complete unless we take our human failings into it. It doesn't mean that I necessarily have always to live my human failings. I obviously may have to take responsibility for them. But they are not only part of me, but they are part of every human being. That is to say, it is part of man.
Consciousness is one factor, and there is another factor, equally important, that is the unconscious, that can interfere with consciousness any time it pleases. And of course, I say to myself now, this is very uncomfortable, because I think I am the only master in my house, but I must admit that there is another somebody in that house that can play tricks. And I had to deal with the unfortunate victims of that interference every day in my patients.
Analysis, proper, particularly Jungian analysis, begins and ends with conscience. That is, that you take responsibility, that you take into consideration all those manifestations which so far have remained in the unconscious. In other words, you were not conscious of. And if you start taking the responsibility for those manifestations, like shadow qualities and whatnot, then this is a very strong test for your conscience, isn't it? And so, I mean, you have to only have to think of the beginning of psychoanalysis. I mean, it took an enormous amount of moral courage to face these facts, which so far have not been considered or repressed.
I felt that Jung should tell me what I should do, whether I should write a book, whether I should get a divorce, what I should do. And he wouldn't. And so I got mad at him. And I said, why is everybody so mean to me? And he said, why are you so mean to everybody? So I stormed out. And you got what I said there. I said to him, why is everybody so mean to me? And he said, why are you so mean to everybody? That was the trigger point. I was gone for a year. And I wrote him, oh, I don't know. Every now and then I'd sit down at the typewriter and write him what a son of a bitch I thought he was. And how when I first got to Europe, everyone thought he was a charlatan. I thought he was too. And I didn't, he was the most conceited, vain man. And I really had a great time. And
you sent all these letters?
Sent the letters, of course I did. And I thought, I hope he drops dead of a stroke. And I felt very good. I just felt fine. When I can get mad, I can lose 5 pounds just by getting mad. It's just the adrenaline goes, and I just think, you know, it's the opposite of poor little me. And I don't care. They let the world go and stuff it up. I don't care what happens to them. And then one morning I woke up, and I began to laugh. I thought, for God's sake, what's been going on here? What a jackass you. And suddenly I realized, sure, he really hit it. And so I phoned Miss Schmidt, Fräulein Schmidt, and asked if I could have an appointment. And she laughed and said, oh, yes, she said, Professor Jung told me to save some time for you. He thought you'd be calling shortly.
And sometimes he'd be quite unfair to one. And he'd tell me, at the club, for instance, he'd go and something's been horrid to people. And then he'd go home saying, now, wasn't that nasty of me? I really spoilt their weekend, I'm sure. It was always on Saturday evenings. But when they next came to analysis, he found that that particular nastiness was exactly what they wanted, what they needed. I really got more from Jung when he hit me over the head than any other time. I don't mean literally.
He had very small eyes, and when he looked through those little eyes, well, usually over the top of his eyeglasses, you knew that he was looking at something that you couldn't see. And what came out was usually some very simple fact. It wasn't any aura or any great message that came back from the beyond. It was something about your ordinary life or the ordinary situation. I described a party where I felt the shadow got loose with Jung in the center of it, where they threw a knotted towel from one person to another around a circle. Jung kept this thing going almost beyond endurance, and I fell down and broke my glasses, and somebody else skinned a knee, and at the end of the party we were all in shambles, but this was characteristic of Jung's intolerance of persona. He was so afraid that the party would stick on a polite persona level that he engineered it to bring out the shadow. And in the end, we all had a marvelous time. We all got drunk, and it was it ended very happily.
He became a human being, and a total one. I mean, he included everything. He could be terrible.
He could be terrible.
He could be absolutely terrible.
Oh, in these ranges.
Yeah. I remember one thing when we sailed on the lake up there, Bollingen, you know, in his boat, and there was a car. The wind died down completely, and we were way up from the Turm, you know.
I see. Yes.
Way off, and so there was nothing else but to row. And I was an old sailor, and you know, I knew how to row, indeed, better than he did, as a matter of fact.
And also young.
So I went and rowed, and he started criticizing me for every single part of a movement I made with those rows. You know. And he knew it better, of course.
Oh, and did he row himself?
Joan was in the boat as well, my wife, and so it was absolutely, it was hell. It was real hell. Until I said, good, fine, do it yourself.
Yes, you finally said. And he did it?
Yes, he had to.
He had to if you gave.
He had to. Yes. I wouldn't make one single move.
So, and did he ever apologize? No. Really?
Oh, he could be terrible. Oh, he could be real devil.
When I was his secretary, he grumbled at me with a very loud voice, and he didn't like when I took it personally, so I took it, and sooner or later there was a big and very beautiful, how do you say, belohnung, recompense, a compensation. He compensated it. He knew exactly what he had done, and then one was rewarded if one could stand it, and if one didn't took it personally. You see, he was so burdened by his ideas and by people outside and his inner figures. So I understood it quite well. He had to have a let out, besides ventil.
Ventilate.
And went out. The steam has to go out.
Yes. And it sometimes came out on you when you were there.
Yes, why not?
Yeah.
the personal shadow is the personal shortcomings of things which every human being could be conscious of, which is not archetypal. For instance, such things as greed for money or jealousy, inferiorities which everybody has, but prefers not to know about. If one is jealous or if one is suddenly possessed by wanting money or so on, one could know about it if one is honest with oneself. But the collective shadow has to do with the dark side of the archetype of the self. That means it's the shadow of the God image. In the Christian tradition, it would be the devil. And that has always been personified and felt as something which has not to do directly with the human being. I mean, if somebody is possessed by the devil, he's much worse than just, he's not human, it's demonic. And but on the other hand, generally that merges. First you have this area of dim, dark side, and behind it lurks the other. I've, for instance, seen that when Germany went to the devil in Nazism, people fell into it through their personal shadow. For instance, they didn't want to lose their job because they were clinging to money. That was their personal shadow. But then they joined in with the Nazi movement for that reason and did much worse things than they would have done normally under normal social conditions. So you can say the personal shadow is the bridge to the collective shadow, or the open door to the collective shadow. But the collective shadow comes up in those terrible mass psychoses. It's like if you have a room and there's one door not shut, and there the devil can come in. And if you know your personal shadow, you can shut all the doors.
I think that it's quite an important fact historically that there were very few of us that intentionally became analysts. What happened was that we all had neuroses, and we were nice, fat, juicy ones, and we were vibrating like an Aeolian harp in a high wind. And very often this was exacerbated by a marriage relationship. And so that most of us of my generation didn't prepare to be an analyst, but we went to an analyst so that he could tinker with our psyches. And somewhere along the line we'd say, wouldn't it be peachy if I could be one of those too?
I have to remember our first appointment, because Joe and I went together, and he talked right over the top of my head to Joe, arranging my appointments. And I finally said, well, where do I come in? And he said, oh, that comes later. And I'll never forget that.
Jane and I arrived in Zurich in 1932. We had a very deep bond between the two of us, but we also were very dissimilar. And so we got into horrendous clashes and crashes. We just were anxious to get a hold of something that would give us some tools to work with so that we could resolve these clashes.
I was not so enamored of him at first. I thought the way he talked, no, it was his writing. Of course, it was very intuitive writing, and it wasn't my dish. And I kept thinking, who the hell does he think he is? You know, how do you know what he's saying? I mean, how does he know what he's saying is is right. And I was really very resistant.
It is almost a rule, but I don't want to make too many rules. In order not to be schematic,
Yes.
That an introvert marries an extrovert for compensation, or another type marries the counter type to complement himself.
I thought, well, he's just talking through his hat, and I just can't go for that stuff. Until I got in trouble and had him head on, and then, my God, he just made all kinds of sense. I liked his opening comment. He said, oh, so you're in the soup too. I like the two.
Together.
Yeah.
The archetype is a force, it has an autonomy. It can suddenly seize you. It is like a seizure.
Yes.
So, for instance, falling in love at first sight, that is such a case. You see, you have a certain image in yourself, without knowing it, of the woman, of the woman.
Yes.
Now you see that girl, or at least a good imitation of your type, and instantly you get a seizure, and you're gone. And afterwards, you may discover that it was a hell of a mistake. Or you see, a man is quite capable, he's intelligent enough to see that that woman of his choice, as one says, not no choice, he has been captured.
Yeah.
You know, he sees that she is no good at all, that she is a hell of a business. And he tells me so, and he said, for God's sake, doctor, help me to get rid of that woman. He can't. He's like clay in her fingers. And that is the archetype. That is so-called archetype of the anima.
Yes, yes.
He thinks it is all his soul, you know. Like the girls, you know, when a man sings very high, then he thinks he must have a very wonderful spiritual character because he can sing the high C.
Yes.
And she's badly disappointed when she marries that particular number.
Yes.
Well, that is the archetype of the animus.
Yeah.
This is built right into the center of Jung's whole psychology, that one should develop one's countersexual components, as Margaret Mead so quaintly phrases it. But Jung prefers to talk about the animus and the anima, meaning the feminine side of the masculine side of the woman and the feminine side of the man. And so that all of us who are really committed and involved in the Jungian world are very busy trying to develop our animuses or our animas, and we don't ever expect that it's going to be quite a dead heat and that our voices will alternate from soprano to basso, or that we are going to get a reissue of our vital parts. But on the other hand, we do feel that usually going on a two-step operation, first with the projection of one's anima or one's animus, and then the gradual peeling of it off and taking it back in again and assimilating it and hopefully integrating it into one's consciousness, that this androgynous or almost androgynous state of being is the way one hopes to be before they throw the switch.
In the beginning stages of a relationship, there's generally a lot of projection mixed up with it. And that is responsible for all those love quarrels. I mean, she makes demands which he can't fulfill, and he makes demands she can't fulfill, and animus anima crossing the swords. And I mean, if you tape record a love quarrel, it's the same all over the world, literally. And that is projection. And if people don't run away, but work it out and take back all what is projection in it, then appears or is peeled out of all this the true relationship. Now, it might be none. And then it would be like the Freudian thing, goodbye, and now I see you simply represented that and that in me, and thank you very much, goodbye. Or there might be a tremendous amount of relationship, true relationship built up, which is not the same thing as projection.
The intensity of our struggle suddenly became clear to me that Jane had a thinking function developed, and I had a developed feeling function. And of course that was upside down. Everybody knows that men think and women feel, only what didn't happen to be so with us.
But I think that what he did for women came through his tremendous interest in the individual. And women could be individuals too. And this problem of what is feminine and what is masculine and so forth and so on almost came as second to that. Mm-hmm. So I think in a sense, and then of course his discovery of the animus and the anima, that did a lot.
Jung was not apt to be a father figure. He was in an astonishing way near to you. Natural. He could sit down and after 10 seconds you felt to speak with a brother, not with a father. And if you have had this brother relationship to him, where you discussed in a free way, where you accepted that he got angry, where you also were ready to get angry at him, as men do in an upright, clear way, it was easy to get along with him. But the moment where one thought that he was a father figure, he was for men very destructive. Because he was too irrational to give a guidance as a father. He changed too openly, too often his mind to give such a guidance. Now, it's a natural thing to change one's mind. But a normal thing. But a father should give a certain guidance. And he had no intention at all to give a guidance. So for men, it was often difficult because the moment men look, and many men look for a father, whereas with women it went along much better because a woman doesn't look so much for a father, she looks for a lover. And he was charming, seducing, and there he offered transference, often a little bit too much. But with a great healing power. With a great healing power.
Well, what about the atmosphere in Zurich at that time?
Well, that's what put me off. Oh, the cultism was just reeking. It was just awful. There were the transferences. And I swore I would never get a transference. That one thing I decided right away, because it just looked too awful. I mean, these people were just goofy. And but I got a transference.
Couldn't help it.
Couldn't help it. Because I mean, after all, you get a transference because what's missing in you has got to be seen in somebody else. And there was plenty missing in me, you know, and with a man of Jung's caliber, there's a lot missing.
It is a regular observation that when you talk to an individual, and this individual gives you insight into its inner preoccupations, interests, emotions. In other words, hands over his personal complexes. Then you get slowly and nilly-willy into the situation of a sort of authority. Yes. You become a point of reference. You know you are in possession of all the important items in a in a person's development. Now you see, that creates an emotional relationship to the analyst. And that is what Freud called the transference.
Yes.
Which is a central problem of analytic psychology. It is just so as if these people had handed out their whole existence, and that can have very peculiar effects upon the individual. Either they hate you for it or they love you for it, yes. But you are not indifferent to them.
But I never felt as though I had too much transference. It didn't last too long because Jung, the one nice thing about, or the good thing about him was he gave so much of himself. He just gave you everything he had. So it wasn't as though you had a hangover. You got it all, you know?
I never felt in awe of him. I just thought sometimes he was funny. When we used to have a little argument about God, he said, oh, you know, I'm not so sure about God. I'm perfectly willing if he shows up, fine. I used to say to you, of course, if he shows up, he'll probably look like you. And, I guess that I thought before I got mad at him, I thought that he would have some kind of a solution to life's problems. Then I found I had to find the solution myself, which I suppose was what he did. Brings you to that point.
We didn't know whether we were fish, flesh or fowl, and we had to find ourselves anew. I dreamt that Jung was a Protestant clergyman standing at a pulpit giving a sermon, and we were all in the pews, and when he finished his sermon, all the others got up and began to chant mandala, mandala, the way they might in Christian times have said Hosanna. And this represented a worshipful attitude to Jung that was laughable, as you can imagine. So I thought, I hate to tell Jung this dream, but I did. And he said, well, of course you should feel that way. I was simply projecting my own Protestant background, making Jung a father figure, making the other people into a group which they were not.
Freud always wanted to break a transference and to
resolve it.
To resolve it and to bring people to life again, down to the adaptation to life again. But Jung had another point of view, had the feeling as long as we have a strong transference, one must serve it, because he said there is a greater personality involved in transference. And we don't know what this greater personality has in storage, and so we must serve it. And that was tremendously difficult for Jung. He often told us, you see, I should have 10 lives in order really to follow the development of the individuation process so deeply as he did with us all.
Yes.
But that was also what interested him. He many times said, without you women, I couldn't have developed my psychology.
I had a case that was an intelligent young woman. She was a student of philosophy, very good mind, where one could expect easily that she would see that I am not the parental authority. But she was utterly unable to get out of this delusion. And in such a case, one always has recourse to the dreams. It is just as if one would ask the unconscious, now what do you say to such a condition? You see, she says with the unconscious, of course I know you are not my father, but I just feel like that. It is like that. I depend upon you. And And I say, now we will see what the unconscious says. Now the unconscious produced dreams in which I really assumed a very curious role. You know, she was the little infant, she was sitting on my knees, I held her in my arms, I was a very tender father to the little girl, you know, and more, her dreams became emphatic in that respect, namely that I was a sort of giant, and she is a very little, frail human thing, you know, and quite a little girl in the hands of an enormous being. And the last dream of that series was, I cannot tell you all the dreams, was that it was out in nature. I stood in a field of wheat, an enormous field of wheat that was ripe for harvest. And I was a giant. And I held her in my arm like a baby. And the wind was blowing over that field of wheat. Now, you know, when the wind is blowing over wheat field, these waves in the wheat field. Yes, yes. And with these waves, I swayed like that, putting her as if it were to sleep, you know. And she felt as being in the arms of a god, of the Godhead. Mm-hmm. And I thought, now the harvest is ripe. Yes. And I must tell her. And I told her, you see, what you want and what you project into me, because you are not conscious of it, is you have the idea of a deity. You don't possess. Therefore, you see it in me. Yes. That clicked. She suddenly became aware of an entirely heathenish image. Yes. That comes fresh from the archetype. She had not the idea of a Christian God or of an Old Testament Yahweh. It was a heathenish God, you see, a god of nature, of vegetation. He was the wheat himself. He is the spirit of the wheat, the spirit of the wind. And she was in the arms of that Numen. No. Now, that is the living experience of an archetype. Now, that made a tremendous impression upon that girl, and instantly it clicked. She saw what she really was missing, that missing value, that was in the form of a projection in myself and made myself indispensable to her. Yes. And then she saw it is not indispensable, because it is, as the dream says, she is in the arms of that archetypal idea. Now that is a luminous experience, you see. And that is the thing that people are looking for. Yes. An archetypal experience that gives them an incorruptible value. You see, they depend upon other conditions. They depend upon their desires, their ambitions, depend upon other people, because they have no value in themselves. They have nothing in themselves. They are only rational, and they are not in the possession of a treasure that would make them independent. But when that girl can hold that experience, then she doesn't depend anymore. She cannot depend anymore, because that value is in herself. And that is a sort of liberation. Yeah. And that is, of course, makes her complete, you know. Inasmuch as she can realize such a luminous experience, she is able to continue her path, her way, her individuation. The acorn can become an oak and not a donkey.
If you have a relationship to C.G. Jung, then you have to work on it, and the meaning is a result, perhaps, you see. One can say I projected on him a father, but I also projected on him a mother, you see. And the one who accepted me, I could say. And from this, in the course of the years, I found a place in this world. I found a place in myself and in the world. A transference is a projection. Yes. So I projected on him this and that, and he took it seriously, and he acted accordingly. But he never laughed at it. He accepted it. He accepted it.
I remember once a patient wanted to marry Jung. She was convinced that he was the man for her and for her lifetime. In vain, Jung explained to her that he already was married. She continued to be convinced, and therefore Jung accepted. She went on, prepared a marriage dinner, had printed cards, everything was ready. Jung continued to accept in full confidence of unconscious reactions coming from the patients or from him. And the day before the planned marriage, he got an express letter from the patient telling him that this night God had told her that unhappily enough the marriage would not be possible. The patient came out of her psychosis, had always in her memory this event, and was completely balanced afterwards. That's how Jung handles the transference situation as a full reality, and having fully confidence in the unconscious, which would lead the patient and himself through the seemingly difficult situation.
He could see what every woman was really substantially like and helped her to find her main interest: literature, politics, psychotherapy, or astrology, or what you want. He had an art to follow a person until she found herself. And the value of transference was great for Jung himself.
It really was as if he was always inside of your unconscious, and not trespassing, but because he has been where everyone was, and so he knew how to be there. He also would never use any of his terms, ever. My last interview, I told him a dream, and I realized, my God, that man is 85 years old. And it was pages of dream, and so I only told him half the dream, thinking I can't put that on him. And so then he started. You know, he didn't ask you for one association. Very seldom he did. He just started to talk. And I was kind of not making the connection, which what he was talking about had anything to do with my dream, but I knew better that I will find the connection if I listen eventually. And suddenly he said, "Oh, that is as if you dream," and he told me the second part of my dream, which I hadn't told him.
After about 2 years, I had a dream in which Jung had died. And I was in his house in the antechamber where he was laid up. And I paced up the room, very depressed, very unhappy. And suddenly my feeling changed, as if I pulled up my socks and, well, all right, he's dead now, this was to go on and work. I told Jung that dream, and he said, well, all right, now you can see patients. You're ready to see patients.
One didn't see it, but one felt it, that a ray of his spirit was falling onto us. And one was terribly spoiled, because compared with this, as a man, we are no more so interesting.
Yes, that must have been a problem. And
I must say, besides one's own husband.
Well, you were married. And
I was married.
You had a deep relationship. And how did your husband feel? Did he ever feel jealous of you?
Clear. all our husbands, the husbands of the women around were very jealous.
Yes.
But since they knew and understand that Jung was not falling into the traps and wishes of the women, so they had not to be really jealous, because Jung never misused his position and all these transferences.
Now, Jung worked in this rejected feminine world of the unconscious for years. People came to him. He was particularly successful with women patients. And one person came into his life very early on, because she's already with Jung and Emma Jung at the famous conference in Vienna, where they are all photographed together. And that is Toni Wolff.
Well, all I can say is that, of course, she was a most extraordinary person, there's no doubt about that, and she was a great help to Jung, too. I mean, when it comes to psychological types, for instance, she played a very important part there.
In his development of his ideas.
He had all his knowledge in philosophy and so on and so forth. And she had been one of his patients to begin with.
I see.
Oh, yes. And I remember very well, he was very proud of the fact that he had succeeded in curing her.
A lot of people who knew her said that they despaired of her ever recovering from whatever her psychological disturbance was. I think one must accept that it was profound enough to fit the rare, exceptional spirit that she was, because in a sense, the rarer, the more exceptional the spirit, the deeper the psychological suffering. And Jung managed to bring her out of this, so that by the time of the famous Vienna conference, she was already an integrated, working personality. And to me, that photograph is very moving, because the one who looks young, as if she's just been born, is Toni Wolff. She sits there with these large eyes. Jung had an instinct that what was wrong with life, what made life tear apart, made it incomplete, was because the feminine was rejected, driven insane, driven mad by a world of men, rejected by a masculine-dominated world. And that time when he let himself go, and when he landed deep down in what he came to call the collective unconscious, all this rejected feminine in himself confronted him.
Toni Wolff was being analyzed by Jung. When Jung started to have his active imagination, it really got going and he got rather unstable. And that Toni Wolff simply said that she wasn't going to go on with her analysis with him and that she was going to have a relationship with him. And more or less, I gather, took him by the ear and did so.
In this unfamiliar, terrifying underground of the collective unconscious, she was Jung's guide, to such an extent that she lived with him. And she took over the whole of the burden. And of course the tensions caused by that in Zurich and in the family must have been tremendous.
She reflected his anima in a way that Mrs. Jung didn't.
It was she who introduced him to all the Eastern things, Eastern spirituality, Eastern philosophy, and so on.
They were lovers, I take it?
Oh, yes.
Yes. Emma knew of their relationship, but she didn't wish to divorce you.
Oh, good gracious, no. It would never have entered her head.
No, I see.
I mean, that wouldn't have been done. I mean,
that's rather unusual.
No, I don't think so. Not at that time. I mean, I don't even think nowadays. I mean, she had 4 children, and I don't think that Jung would have wanted a divorce at all.
Well, perhaps this isn't really relevant, but not many women will countenance open infidelity.
Please forgive me. I am not so sure if that is not a kind of British, maybe even English prejudice, conditioning, or something. I think that...
I think it's an American one too.
Is it?
Without Toni Wolff, he couldn't have made it, because she had breaks in a way, and she was stopping him always when he had a temperament where he was losing himself completely and without boundaries. And Toni Wolff stopped him and always brought him back to reality, and that was tremendously important for Jung.
Was she originally a patient?
And then she also understood him.
Yes.
She had such a bright mind that she grasped it even before he understood it. And she was also really furthering his intuition very much, because at that time he was also, I mean, he was a medical doctor. He had worked at the asylum of Burghölzli, yes. And he was very intellectual until really he came to know her.
That was the point. There was nothing shadow in it, no shadow. And Jung wanted to be and tried to be as conventional as possible, wherever possible. So that in the inner world, and in his relationships with both women, he could be as unconventional as he really was, as unique as he really was. No, it was quite a thing for him to do around 1910. You know, the Victorian age wasn't quite so far gone, and it wasn't anything he hid. You know, I remember I was walking in Zurich, there near the institute, and there was Jung and Toni Wolff walking. You know? There was nothing hiding, and it was in this relationship that he had these tremendous experiences of the conjunctio. That's when he understood the mystical background of sexuality, mystical or the psychological archetype that was working there.
That was later such an established relationship, and Mrs. Jung was so included that I am very sure he would not have parked his car in front of Toni Wolff's house, who was 1 minute away from the institute, and everybody would know when he was there and when he was not there, if he would have had the slightest doubts about it.
And so this relationship with Toni Wolff was not an affair, it was another wife.
2 wives and 1 man. That's an excuse. My opinion is he should, as CG, he should know earlier that that was his anima, and so come to a stop.
One day, Mrs. Jung approached me and said, "Would you please cooperate analytically with me and Toni Wolff?" So we did a threesome analysis for quite a long period of time.
Oh.
Yeah, that was very funny.
I see. Mutual dreams or just Jung's dreams?
No Jung's dreams. Mrs. Jung's dreams and Toni's dreams and my dreams.
Oh, all 3?
Yeah.
I see. And you found this very helpful?
It was interesting.
Right.
It was very
interesting. She wasn't at all browbeaten by Jung. She was downright and direct, and she did a lot of work on his papers, too. She obviously stood by Jung all through his periods of crisis. She was a much more solid sort of character than Jung.
First, she had given birth to 5 children. And then Jung told us, and she told us, and she felt the need also to know more. And then she studied physics and mathematics and many other things. And then she had an analysis with her own husband.
She did?
Yes.
How difficult.
Yes. She had also another analysis But the main thing was analysis with Jung. And afterwards, he allowed her to analyze. And she was a very good analyst. And the opposite of her husband, he was more intuition and thinking. And Emma Jung was sensation, mainly sensation. Absolutely down to the earth, and more to that, to the depths of the earth.
Mrs. Jung had a fantastic sense of humor. She giggled and laughed, and she was very, very nice woman. Motherly, but I think she helped a lot in working out, let's say, the animus anima problem. It's those three who did the work, I think.
Emma Jung said to a close friend of mine just before she died that she had never ceased to be grateful in her life for Toni Wolff, because Toni Wolff was able to do for her husband something that she could not have done.
I think what's remarkable is that they made it. And I think they're the ones, that Toni and Emma are the ones that made the threesome situation possible. They worked out something between them.
Jung, in his dedication copy of Answer to Job, wrote, well, I have to translate it, unasked, dropped from heaven. Ungefragt vom Himmel gefallen. So, no, I think naturally the relationship changed, the relationship do change, but it existed.
And he was always very present and very concerned also about the future of life on this globe. I think he needed space and quietness to meditate about them and to find as much answer as he could find. It was at the same time, I think, a total participation, but also well, I wouldn't call it a withdrawal, but a philosophical distance, or I don't know how to call it.
He went to Bollingen so often during the year, and he did all his reading up there.
Most of the reading was done there, and also most of the writing?
Also the writing.
In the fall of 1922,
Da ist er mit dem Velo noch von Küsnacht.
He came by bicycle. Dr. Jung came by bicycle on his bicycle from Küsnacht. The western part of the land was sold by Mr. Hugenwatter's father to Dr. Jung. Mr. Hugenwatter's father and Dr. Jung had a very good relation. That's a Brüder. Gerade am Film. Ja, nein, ist schön. Und der Brüder auch noch. Großvater. Und Sie haben das im letzten Moment beschlossen.
Ich habe mit jedem geredet.
He spoke with everybody.
Wenn ich in Ochs ist, behalten.
And when they were in trouble, you see, for instance, with bringing in the hay before it came raining, Dr. Jung would help them.
A man is not complete when he lives in a world of statistical truth. He must live in a world of his biological truth. Man has always lived in the myth. And we think we are able to be born today and to live in no myth, without history. That is a disease. That's absolutely abnormal, because man is not born every day. He's once born in a specific historical setting with the specific historical qualities, and therefore he is only complete when he has a relation to these things. It's just as if you were born without eyes and ears, when you are growing up with no connection with the past. From the standpoint of natural science, you need no connection with the past. You can wipe it out.
Yes.
And that is a mutilation of the human being.
He had what the Greeks called techne, hence our word technology and so on. And techne means also art and skill. He lived his sensation, I think, in its natural state, and therefore it was very creative. He looked at the wall in his last years. You see the irregularities of the stone would create that picture, and then he would carve it out.
The statements of every religion, of many poets and so on, are statements about the inner mythological process, which is a necessity, because man is not complete if he is not conscious of that aspect of things.
Well, we have to revive primitive superstition, because in primitive people, their sword has a soul, their hammer has a soul. No smith would start making a sword without a ritual first. Still in the Middle Ages, the heroes who depended on their sword, think if your sword breaks in battle, you're a dead man. So their sword had a name and a soul. They knew that sword, and the solidity of that sword was their fate. And now it's still so. Let a few of your atomic plants explode, and please. Matter if it has to cooperate with you needs loving care, and not only technically by oiling and so on. You have to kind of live with it. Otherwise it plays you tricks. one of the last times he went to the tower, for instance, he hadn't been there for a long time, and the first days the covers of the pans like to jump off and fall on the floor in the wrong moments, and you know how objects can absolutely misbehave. So he put himself up in the middle of the kitchen and said, now, ladies and gentlemen, pots and spoons, I know I have neglected you for a long time and you are angry with me, but I beg your pardon and I ask you now to cooperate again. And from then on, there were no more accidents. He had great fun with that. If you notice, it's highly symbolic. The days you can't open a door, you can't get at something, or some object hides from you just when generally when you are not in yourself and in an impatient mood or so on, then everything plays you tricks. It's naturally your own unconscious mixed up with it. But it communicates with matter.
We are only deeply unconscious of these facts because we live all by our senses and outside of ourselves. If a man could look into himself, he would discover it.
Yes.
And when a man discovers it, in our days, he thinks he's crazy. And he may be crazy.
He played a lot along the lake, and he did it very often alone. He took always a little shovel, removed the sand, and then played with little rivers and so on. And he said when he was 83, he said one day when we were playing, I was generally watching him, playing a bit with him. And he said to me, you know, only today I have suddenly thought, what am I doing when I'm playing like that? That's what I have done all my life, digging out springs. He was just enjoying that. He called it the waterworks. And always before he was writing, he did some days or even weeks of waterworks till he was in the right mood, and then he began writing. I sat sometimes for hours beside him, just watching, not talking. Once an old peasant went along and said to me, isn't this Professor Jung not a world-famous man? And I said, yes. He is, and he said, wouldn't think it if you see him like that.
I have the feeling I am able to help this thing which guides my life. I am not doing it, but I can help him in some way. And that's something which probably Jung has invoked in me. Your good ideas are not produced by your will. It comes to you. You must make yourself ready. I think that's all, and you must have a certain amount of interest. And that's also when you have a difficulty in yourself, you must be interested. You must get the answers from somewhere. You can't produce it yourself. You can't calculate it, and it must. At least most of the important things come from somewhere, and the rest you can then afterwards work out by a kind of technique or routine and so on. But you can't do everything with routine.
I was always looking for something in between, you know, something that linked that remote past with the present moment. And I found, to my amazement, it is alchemy. It is the basis of our modern way of conceiving things. And therefore, it is as if it were right under the threshold of consciousness. Gives a wonderful picture of how the development of archetypes, that means the movement of archetypes, looks when you look upon them as if from above, namely from today, you look back into the past and you see how the present moment has evolved out of the past. And we can construct or even predict our the unconscious of our days when we know what it has been yesterday.
And when I heard Jung talking about alchemy, it was like a revelation for me to see how, because there are religious ideas which are on the foundation of all these scientific work. The energy that you do, that you start to do chemistry, comes from somewhere which is not a really rational thing. It's an emotional thing.
For Jung, religion was an attitude. For Jung, religion was an attitude to life and had absolutely nothing whatever to do with any kind of creed. And he was actually ambivalent about creeds, because on the one hand he said that a creed would stop you from having an experience, and since he believed that religion was not only an attitude but had to do with experience, personal experience, if you block it by a creed, obviously you can't have an experience. But at the same time he also thought that a creed might be a tremendously important framework for someone whose ego was too weak to stand the horror, the void of complete loneliness.
He was always saying, why don't the priests go down with me into the collective, into the unconscious of modern man, to learn what the modern soul is about before they start to cure it, because nobody would look at the soul of man in the modern way. They all behaved, as I said before, as if creation was accomplished, if the soul was an accomplished fact. And it wasn't. That's why the book of Revelations had so much meaning to Jung. And that's why he saw it having its place in the Bible. You know, Calvin fought very desperately to have the book of Revelation removed from the Bible, because he called it a dark and dangerously obscure book. But it really is very meaningful, because it's the one book which suggests that the revelation of God doesn't end with the coming of Christ. There is more to come. That religion is a process of continuing revelation and experiencing of revelation, and being obedient to your greater awareness of becoming in life.
He was very conscious of the center of his being, which he called the self. And he would talk about the God image, living, being alive, in this center of our whole being. He always said he did not wish to discuss the existence of God, because this was a metaphysical question which he was not prepared to go into. But from the psychological point of view, he knew that the God image was within oneself. The God image changes. God does not change.
I never could claim that any kind of human work could reveal something about the nature of God or about his existence. I only know that the idea of God is a pattern, an age-old pattern, a primitive pattern that always has been and never lost its, what we call, luminosity. It is always there and it still plays the same role as it always did. We can establish the existence of that pattern, and that is for our practical purposes enough. Because when we can integrate such an idea in our mind, the idea of such a being, then that gives an entirely different scope to things.
He does not project, you see, so to speak, or does not confuse the image of God that exists in man with God himself. He says he cannot make any statements about God, but about the image of God as it exists in the human being, you know. And so this whole ego-self relationship is really at the, so to speak, at the basis of Jung's work. That's all it is about, you know. But the self-experience as something inside man, but not the same as the ego, you know. But he doesn't project it.
Jung puts the burden squarely on each person. And this psychology of individuation, of making what you are, and what you've inherited of the universe, of making that specific, of making what you've got of the collective in you, making that individual, and carrying it as an individual, and not only standing still in it, but allowing an act of becoming in the midst of your being, to become your own way of moving through life. This is the hardest thing you can ask of human beings.
What would you say the main value of the research and the writing that you and Jung have done on alchemy is?
I would say that a civilization needs a myth to live. We know that if missionaries destroy the myth of a primitive people, they destroy them also physically. They begin to drink, they degenerate, they are lost. And no civilization can live only from welfare. It needs a myth to live. All great civilizations, when they were flourishing, had a living myth. And I think that the Christian myth on which we have lived has degenerated and has become one-sided and insufficient. And I think that alchemy is the complete myth. And that therefore, if our Western civilization has a possibility of survival, it would be by accepting the alchemical myth, which is a completion and continuation, and richer completion of the Christian myth. That's a myth we could live again with, in contrast to the Christian myth, which doesn't satisfy a great amount of people anymore. And the Christian myth is deficient on not including enough the feminine, or in Catholicism they have the Virgin Mary, but it's only the purified feminine. It's not the dark feminine. And in excluding matter and treating matter as dead and the realm of the devil. And in not facing the problem of the opposites of evil. And alchemy faces the problem of the opposites, faces the problem of matter, and faces the problem of the feminine. The three things which are lacking in Christianity. And therefore it complements the Christian myth and could revive it too that way.
For 2,000 years, the Christian religion has told you to repress the evil. And look at the damn thing now. It began to be so visible at the First World War. And that's now a very great many years ago, isn't it? Not sure.
And it's on a much grander scale, much larger scale, the possibility.
Oh, far. Far.
What is it? What did we learn from alchemy? It's finally that in each of us there is a rejected part, the which can become the cornerstone, like it's written in the Bible. And we have to be aware of the stinking side, of the bad-smelling side, of the, as Jung says, about the urine, about the excrement, and all that in our life. And this is the beginning of the way of God. This is the beginning of the transformation.
The psychology of individuation has nothing to do with politics at all, because it deals with the ultimate values. But yes, it has shattering political implications. And I think we are not now, we cannot behave as if this journey into the collective unconscious hasn't happened. Because it has happened, we can't plead ignorance anymore. It has happened, and because it's happened, because we are facing a universe within, objective universe within, as great as the universe without, we can never be the same again. We cannot ignore it. And it has enormous political consequences for us. And the kind of society, the kind of politics that will save us will have to be where more important than any other quality in our politicians. We must demand psychological illumination, psychological awareness, because otherwise we get people sparring with their own shadows. Otherwise you get nations, as we had in 1939, like the Germans, projecting their shadows onto the Jews. And then when they were eliminating the Jews, onto the Poles and God knows what not else, you see. And Jung often said to me, he said, the human being who starts by withdrawing his own shadow from his neighbor is doing work of immense, immediate political and social importance.
What you would call the personal shadow of people didn't upset him. He just grumbled and cursed a bit, but that's not the problem of evil. It's that major evil of complete destruction which worried him.
And his real approach to that was the inner work
yes,
that he did.
The only thing you can do, to confront yourself with it where you are. All the rest, all the benevolent, if benevolent preaching would help, then we would be out of the trouble long ago, because we get a lot of benevolent and reasonable preaching, but it doesn't help. So the only place where you can really put the hand on it and deal with it body to body, the problem of evil, is in yourself. And there you have the hope to change something, but the hope to change the world is a childish illusion.
As we've seen, the collectivist pattern taking over all over society, the paradox is you get a form of totalitarianism which is producing collectivism, then you get a kind of creation of greater and greater monopolies of commerce, bigger and bigger business, producing a kind of organization man, which is the equivalent of the totalitarian organization man, where this individual thing disappears. And really, this kind of this kind of politics of individuation, which you might call democracy, ceases to exist. And this is the point where we've reached at the moment. And at this point, all that's inferior, which Jung used to call the shadow in man, tends to come to the surface.
The world hangs on a thin thread. And that is the psyche of man. Nowadays, we are not threatened by elementary catastrophes. There is no such thing as an H-bomb. That is all man's doing.
Yes.
We are the great danger. The psyche is the great danger. What if something goes wrong with the psyche?
Yes.
You see? And so you see, it is demonstrated to us in our days what the power the psyche is of man, how important it is to know something about it, but we know nothing about it. Nobody would give credit to the idea that the psychical processes of the ordinary man have any importance whatever. One thinks, oh, he has just what he has in his head, it is all from his surroundings, his thought such a thing, believes such a thing. And particularly if he's well housed and well fed, then he has no ideas at all. And that's the great mistake. Because he is just that as which he is born, and he is not born as tabula rasa, but as a reality.
Yes.
Jung had a vision at the end of his life of a catastrophe. It was a world catastrophe.
I don't want to speak much about it. One of his daughters took notes and after his death gave it. And there's a drawing with a line going down, up and down, and underneath is the last 50 years of humanity. And some remarks about a final catastrophe being ahead. But I have only those notes.
Mm-hmm. What is your own feeling about it, the world situation?
Well, one's whole feeling revolts against this idea. But since I have those notes in a drawer, I don't allow myself to be too optimistic. I think, well, we have always had wars and enormous catastrophes, and I have no more personal fear much about that. I mean, at my age, if you have anyhow soon to go, so or so, egocentrically spoken. But the beauty of all the life, to think that the billions and billions and billions of years of evolution to build up the plants and the animals and the whole beauty of nature, and that man would go out of sheer shadow foolishness and destroy it all. I mean, that all life might go from the planet. And we don't know. On Mars and Venus, there's no life. We don't know if there's any life experiment elsewhere in the galaxies. And we go and destroy this. I think it's so abominable. I try to pray that it may not happen, that a miracle happens.
Do you find that young people that you see now are aware of that it's in their consciousness?
Yes, it's partly in their unconscious and partly in their consciousness, and I think in a very dangerous way, namely in a way of giving up and running away into a fantasy world. You know, when you study science fiction, you see there's always the fantasy of escaping to some other planet and begin anew again, which means give up the battle on this earth. Look, consider it hopeless and give up. I think one shouldn't give up. Because if you think of answer to Job, if man would wrestle with God, if man would tell God that he shouldn't do it, if we would reflect more. That's why reflection comes in. Jung never thought that we might do better than just possibly sneak around the corner with not too big a catastrophe. When I saw him last, he had also a vision while I was with him, but there he said, I see enormous stretches devastated, enormous stretches of the earth. But thank God it's not the whole planet. I think that if not more people try to reflect and take back their projections and take the opposites within themselves, there will be a total destruction. There are a lot of people who go through life and the unconscious is no reality to them. They say at breakfast I had a funny dream, and that in the afternoon they don't know anything about it anymore. But if they paint them and interpret them and think about them, the dream becomes real. And that's why you have to be lonely, so that the unconscious becomes stronger. It's like loading up the unconscious, and then it manifests. Hermes Trismegistus said in one active imagination to an alchemist, I am the friend of whoever is lonely. We have now, you see, it's a man who pours water into the fish. Now the fish is the unconscious, the content. So we have to support the unconscious. It's not enough to just have it. We have to actively turn towards it and support it so that it then helps us. Many people are not in analysis, but if they are naturally gifted, which I would call if they are honest, they can find these things without analysis. I've lived in this tower sometimes 3 weeks alone without speaking to one word to anybody. And I sometimes thought I was going off my head. But the unconscious became alive. It was my partner.
There are no other similar beings like man that are articulate and could give account of their functioning